How your childhood shapes 95% of your thinking. What if I told you that the person making your decisions right now isn't actually you, it's a version of you that was programmed between ages 0 and 7, operating on outdated survival algorithms that have nothing to do with your current reality? Not metaphorically. Your brain's core operating system was written during childhood and has been running largely unexamined ever since. This isn't therapy couch speculation. This is hard developmental neuroscience. Researchers studying brain development and neuroplasticity have documented something disturbing. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, doesn't fully develop until age 25. But your limbic system, governing emotions, reactions, and survival responses, is fully wired by age 7. This means your fundamental behavioral patterns, emotional triggers, and unconscious beliefs were established when you had the cognitive sophistication of a first grader. Here's what changes everything. These early programmed patterns don't fade with age. They run continuously in your subconscious, generating 95% of your thoughts, emotional reactions, and behavioral choices without your awareness. You're essentially a sophisticated adult consciousness piloting a control system designed by a child. Ancient wisdom traditions spoke of unfinished business and karmic patterns. Modern neuroscience calls them implicit memories and procedural conditioning, neural pathways carved during childhood that continue directing your life decades later. I'm about to reveal 10 specific protocols for identifying and reprogramming these childhood installed patterns that are secretly controlling your adult life. Your child self is still driving. Time to take the wheel. Body. The 10 TechniQuest Part 1. Implicit Memory Excavation Protocol. You think you remember your childhood. You don't, at least not the parts that matter most. Your explicit memories, the stories you can recall and describe, are fragmentary. Your implicit memories, the emotional associations and behavioral patterns, are comprehensive and constantly active. Neuroscientists studying memory systems have discovered that your hippocampus doesn't fully mature until age 3, which is why you can't recall early childhood explicitly. But your amygdala, your emotional memory center, is fully functional from birth. This means you have powerful emotional programming from experiences you cannot consciously remember. These implicit memories drive behavior without conscious access to their origins. This is technique number 1 out of 10, the Implicit Memory Excavation Protocol. Here's your exact practice for 30 days. Track your disproportionate emotional reactions. When you experience emotions that seem too intense for the situation, rage at minor criticism, panic at potential rejection, shame over small mistakes, document the trigger and the feeling. Then ask, when is the earliest time I remember feeling exactly this way? Right? Whatever emerges, even if it seems unrelated. Look for patterns across multiple reactions. The mechanism surfaces implicit programming. By connecting present emotional reactions to past origins, you're building explicit awareness of implicit patterns. Your prefrontal cortex gains conscious access to childhood encoded reactions that have been operating automatically. You're essentially making the invisible visible through systematic emotional archaeology. Start tracking disproportionate reactions daily and watch childhood patterns emerge from the shadows into conscious awareness. Part 2. Attachment style recognition method. Way your caregivers responded to you before age to created neural templates for how relationships work. These templates, called attachment styles, unconsciously govern every intimate relationship you'll ever have. Most people are completely unaware of their attachment programming. Research on attachment theory reveals that your early caregiver interactions shape your orbitofrontal cortex development, the region managing emotional regulation and social bonding. Inconsistent caregiving creates anxious attachment. Emotionally distant caregiving creates avoidant attachment. These patterns aren't preferences, they're neurological structures that automatically activate in intimate relationships. This is technique number 2 out of 10, the attachment style recognition method. Execute this protocol. Take a validated attachment style assessment, easily found online. Search ECR attachment assessment. Score yourself honestly. Then for 21 days, observe your behavior in close relationships through your attachment lens. When you feel anxious, ask, is this my anxious attachment activating? When you withdraw, ask, is this my avoidant pattern? Document every instance where your attachment style, not the actual situation, drives your behavior. Why this works: you're creating observer distance from automatic attachment reactions. Your prefrontal cortex learns to recognize when childhood relational templates are activating versus When you're responding to present reality, this metacognitive awareness is the first step toward choosing different responses. You're building the capacity to notice the pattern before it controls you. Start identifying your attachment style in action and watch relationship patterns shift from unconscious compulsion to conscious choice. Part 3. Parental internalization. Awareness techniqueo. Have your parents living inside your head, not poetically neurologically. Their voices, judgments, and expectations were internalized during childhood and now operate as your inner critic or inner voice. You think these thoughts are yours. They're not their recordings. Neuroscientists studying introjection have found that children absorb parental attitudes through mirror neurons and social learning circuits. These internalized voices become part of your default mode network, the brain system generating your internal dialogue. You're literally thinking your parents' thoughts and believing they're your own authentic perspective. This is technique number 3 out of 10. The parental internalization awareness technique. Your intervention is specific for 45 days. Practice voice identification during self-criticism. When you hear internal criticism, "You're not good enough," "You always mess up," "You should be better," immediately ask, whose voice is this really? Which parent said things like this? Speak the criticism aloud in your parent's voice, tone, and accent. Notice how different it feels when you recognize it as external programming rather than authentic self-assessment. The mechanism creates separation from internalized voices. By identifying the source, you're activating your prefrontal cortex's ability to evaluate rather than automatically accept. Internal dialogue. You're essentially debugging the code by recognizing which lines were written by your parents versus your authentic self. This separation is psychologically liberating. Start identifying whose voice is actually speaking in your head, and watch crippling self-criticism lose its authority. Part 4. Survival strategy decoding systems. A child facing dysfunction, neglect, or inconsistency. Your brain develops survival strategies, becoming invisible, pleasing everyone, achieving perfectly, controlling everything. These strategies work then. They're sabotaging you now, but your brain still runs them automatically because they're coded as life-saving. Research on childhood adaptation reveals that your nervous system creates procedural memories, behavioral programs that run automatically without conscious thought. These programs were brilliant adaptations to childhood circumstances, but are completely inappropriate for adult situations. Yet they continue executing because your amygdala still codes them as survival necessary. This is technique number 4 out of 10, the survival strategy decoding system. Here's your practice. Identify your primary childhood survival strategy by asking, as a child, what did I do to feel safe, get attention, or avoid pain? Common answers: perfectionism, people-pleasing, invisibility, control, achievement, caretaking. For 60 days, catch yourself executing this strategy in adult situations. Each time, write, my childhood strategy is X. In this adult situation, I actually need Y. Explicitly name the mismatch between child strategy and adult need. Why this works. You're training your prefrontal cortex to recognize when childhood programs are running inappropriately. Each recognition weakens the automatic execution while strengthening conscious choice. Your brain begins distinguishing between past survival requirements and present actual needs. You're essentially updating obsolete survival code. Start catching your childhood survival strategies in action and watch them lose their compulsive grip on your adult behavior. Part 5. Emotional regulation inheritance recognition protocolo. Your family handled emotions became your emotional regulation blueprint. If anger was dangerous, you suppress it. If sadness was ignored, you avoid it. If only certain emotions were acceptable, you developed a limited emotional range. These patterns feel like your personality. They're actually inherited coping mechanisms. Neuroscientists studying emotional development have discovered that children learn emotion regulation primarily through observation and co-regulation with caregivers. Your prefrontal cortex's connections to your limbic system were shaped by how emotions were modeled and responded to. You literally inherited neural patterns for emotional processing. This is technique number 5 out of 10, the emotional regulation inheritance recognition protocol. Execute this sequence. Create a family emotion inventory. For each emotion: anger, sadness, fear, joy, shame, write how your family expressed or suppressed it. Then for 40 days, track your own emotional patterns. When you struggle with an emotion, Check your inventory. Did my family struggle with this exact emotion in this exact way? Notice where your emotional difficulties mirror family patterns, rather than reflecting your authentic emotional needs. The mechanism reveals inherited emotional programming. By mapping family patterns onto your own struggles, you're exposing learned limitations rather than inherent incapacities. Your prefrontal cortex recognizes that emotional difficulties are installed programs, not fixed personality traits. This recognition creates possibility for new emotional responses. Start mapping family emotional patterns onto your own and watch. Inherited emotional limitations become visible and therefore changeable. Part 6. Core Belief Identification. Method between ages 0 and 7. You form core beliefs about yourself, others, and the world based on your experiences. I'm not enough. People leave. The world is dangerous. These beliefs operate as unconscious filters, causing you to unconsciously seek confirming evidence while dismissing contradictory data. Research on schema theory reveals that these early formed beliefs activate your reticular activating system to filter reality in belief-confirming ways. You're not perceiving objective reality, you're perceiving reality through childhood installed belief filters. Your confirmation bias isn't a thinking error. It's your brain protecting childhood conclusions. This is technique number 6 out of 10. The core belief identification method. Your protocol is this. Complete this sentence 20 different ways without censoring. Deep down, I believe I am underscore underscore underscore. Then do the same for deep down. I believe other people are underscore underscore underscore, and deep down, I believe the world is underscore underscore underscore. The beliefs that make you uncomfortable or defensive when written are likely your core schemas. For 50 days, notice when these beliefs activate when you interpret neutral situations through these lenses. Why this works: explicit articulation of implicit beliefs activates your prefrontal cortex's evaluative capacity. Once core beliefs are conscious, your brain can examine their validity rather than accepting them as unquestionable truth. You're exposing the operating system assumptions that have been running unchallenged since childhood. Start explicitly articulating your core beliefs and watch their unconscious influence weaken through conscious examination. Part 7. Trauma Response Pattern Disruption Technique. What you call personality quirks are often trauma responses. Difficulty trusting, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, over-apologizing. These aren't character flaws, they're nervous system adaptations to childhood experiences where these responses enhanced survival. Neuroscientists studying developmental trauma have found that adverse childhood experiences reshape your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and autonomic nervous system. Your threat detection becomes hypersensitive. Your stress response becomes hyperactive. These changes are adaptive in dangerous environments, but dysfunctional in safe ones. Yet your nervous system can't distinguish between then and now. This is technique number 7 out of 10. The Trauma Response Pattern Disruption Technique. Here's your intervention. Learn your nervous system's threat responses: fight, anger, control, flight, avoidance, anxiety, freeze, shutdown, dissociation, or fawn, people pleasing, accommodation. For 35 days, when you notice these responses activating, implement this sequence. 1. Name it. I'm in fight response. 2. Reality check. Am I actually in danger right now? 3. Regulate. Use deep breathing or grounding to signal safety to your nervous system. 4. Respond consciously rather than automatically. The mechanism interrupts automatic trauma patterning. By inserting conscious awareness between trigger and response, you're engaging your prefrontal cortex to override your amygdala's outdated threat assessments. You're essentially teaching your nervous system that childhood danger has ended and new responses are now safe. Start naming and interrupting trauma responses, and watch childhood survival patterns give way to adult-appropriate reactions. Part 8. Scarcity Mentality Recalibration System. If you grew up with financial instability, emotional unavailability, or conditional love, your brain developed a scarcity mentality, believing resources are limited and must be hoarded, earned, or fought for. This mentality operates constantly, creating an artificial limitation even in abundance. Research on scarcity psychology shows that early experiences of deprivation create lasting changes in your anterior cingulate cortex, the region monitoring for threat and scarcity. Your brain becomes hypervigilant for loss and unable to perceive or enjoy sufficiency. You're operating from childhood resource anxiety regardless of current circumstances. This is technique number 8 out of 10. The scarcity mentality recalibration system. Execute this practice. Identify your scarcity domains: money, love, time, attention, safety. For 70 days, practice sufficiency awareness in each domain. 3 times daily, explicitly acknowledge current sufficiency. Right now, I have enough money for my needs. Right now, I have loving relationships. Right now, I am safe. When scarcity thinking arises, notice it. That's my childhood scarcity pattern. What's actually true right now? Why this works? Repeated acknowledgement of present sufficiency retrains your anterior cingulate cortex's threat monitoring. Your brain begins incorporating evidence of abundance that scarcity filters previously blocked. This doesn't deny real limitations, it prevents childhood installed scarcity patterns from creating psychological deprivation amid actual adequacy. Start practicing sufficiency acknowledgement systematically and watch childhood scarcity programming lose its grip on present perception. Part 9. Autonomy Deficit Correction Protocol. If your childhood featured controlling parents, emotional manipulation, or conditional approval, you never fully developed autonomy, the capacity to trust your own judgment, preferences, and decisions. You're still unconsciously seeking external validation for choices that should be internally determined. Neuroscientists studying autonomy development have found that children need consistent opportunities to make choices and experience natural consequences to develop strong connections between their prefrontal cortex and their interoceptive networks. Without this, you remain disconnected from your authentic preferences and dependent on external guidance for decisions. This is technique number 9 out of 10. The Autonomy Deficit Correction Protocol. Your practice is systematic. For 90 days, make one preference decision daily without external input: what to eat, where, watch, do. Before deciding, spend 60 seconds checking internal signals. What do I actually want? Not what should I want? Make the choice based purely on internal preference. Notice when you feel compelled to justify, explain, or seek validation for personal choices. Practice saying, I chose this because I wanted to. That's sufficient reason. The mechanism strengthens autonomy neural circuits. Each internal preference decision strengthens connections between your prefrontal cortex and interoceptive cortex. You're building the capacity to access and trust internal guidance that may never have fully developed in childhood. You're essentially completing interrupted autonomy development. Start making daily choices from internal preference and watch external approval seeking diminish as authentic autonomy emerges. Part 10. Developmental stage. Completion method. Childhood development follows predictable stages. Trust 0 to 18 months. Autonomy 18 months 3 years. Initiative 3 to 6 years. Competence 6 to 12 years. If any stage was disrupted through trauma, neglect, or dysfunction, you carry incomplete development into adulthood. These gaps manifest as persistent struggles in specific areas. Research on developmental psychology reveals that interrupted stages don't just disappear. They create lasting deficits in specific capacities. Adults with trust issues often had disrupted infancy. Adults with shame-based identity often had disrupted toddlerhood. Adults with initiative paralysis often had disrupted early childhood. You can identify your developmental gaps by your persistent struggles. This is technique number 10 out of 10, the developmental stage completion method. Here's your intervention. Identify which childhood stage was most disrupted for you. Research Erikson stages if needed. For 120 days, engage in stage-appropriate developmental work. Trust issues. Practice small trust building with safe people. Autonomy deficits. Practice making choices and setting boundaries. Initiative problems. Practice starting projects without permission. Competence gaps. Practice skill building with self-compassion for mistakes. You're essentially reparenting yourself through the disrupted stage. Why this works? Neuroplasticity allows developmental processes to occur at any age, when appropriate conditions are created. By deliberately engaging in stage-appropriate developmental work, you're completing interrupted neural development. Your brain builds the capacities that should have formed in childhood but were prevented by adverse circumstances. Start targeted developmental stage work and watch long-standing struggles resolve as you complete interrupted childhood development. Closing these 10 protocols aren't therapy. Exercises, they're neurologically grounded methods for identifying and reprogramming the childhood installed operating system that's been running your adult life without your conscious awareness. Implicit memory patterns. attachment templates, internalized voices, survival strategies, emotional regulation inheritance, core belief filters, trauma responses, scarcity mentality, autonomy deficits, developmental gaps,